Don't you dare tell me he's fine. Suga's voice cut through the backstage noise as he turned toward the manager, his eyes red and his jaw trembling. A few feet away, Jungkook was carrying Jimin in his arms, moving quickly through the narrow corridor while Jimin's fingers clutched weakly at Jungkook's jacket. The concert lights still flashed behind them. Thousands of fans were screaming, unaware of what had just happened. Suga took one step forward, then stopped. His hands curled into fists as tears slipped down his face. "Put him down," he whispered, almost pleading. Jungkook looked back, his expression strained. Jimin opened his eyes for only a second and looked directly at Suga. But why did Suga suddenly look away? Had Jimin's fall on stage really been an accident, or was Suga crying because he knew something the others didn't? Tell me honestly, if you were there, whose side would you believe? The concert was still happening when the corridor swallowed Jimin from the audience's view. On the other side of the heavy backstage curtain, the music continued as if nothing had happened. Thousands of light sticks moved in unison beneath the stadium lights, and the bass from the speakers traveled through the floor with every beat. Only moments earlier, Jimin had been standing beneath a wall of white spotlights, smiling toward the crowd as the final section of the performance began. He had been dancing beside Suga, Jungkook, and the other members, moving through choreography they had rehearsed so many times that every step seemed instinctive. Then, during a transition, Jimin's movement changed. At first, almost nobody noticed. His left hand briefly touched his side, his expression tightened for less than a second, and he missed the timing of one turn. Suga noticed. He always noticed small changes in Jimin, especially the ones Jimin tried to hide. Suga shifted closer without breaking the performance, watching him from the corner of his eye while the crowd continued singing. Jimin gave him the smallest smile, the kind that seemed to say, "I'm okay." But before Suga could respond, Jimin took another step and suddenly lost his balance. The sound of his body hitting the stage was almost completely swallowed by the music. Jungkook reacted first, rushing toward him while the other members instinctively adjusted their positions to keep the audience from immediately understanding what had happened. Suga froze for half a heartbeat. Then his face changed. The performer who had spent years mastering composure suddenly looked like someone who had forgotten where he was. A staff member signaled urgently from the side of the stage, but Suga remained focused on Jimin. Jimin tried to push himself upright. He could hear the crowd chanting his name, thousands of voices rising together, but the lights above him had become painfully bright. Jungkook reached him and lowered himself beside him. "Jimin, look at me," he said quietly. "Can you stand?" Jimin nodded, but when he tried to move, his body refused to cooperate. Jungkook immediately made a decision. He slipped one arm beneath Jimin's knees and another behind his back, lifting him away from the center of the stage while the performance continued around them. The audience reacted with confusion. Some fans screamed Jimin's name. Others raised their phones, trying to understand whether the moment was part of the show. Suga followed several steps behind, but a stage manager stopped him briefly, reminding him that the concert could not simply stop. Suga looked toward the crowd, then back toward the corridor where Jungkook had disappeared with Jimin. For the first time that night, the thousands of people in front of him seemed impossibly far away. He forced himself back into position, but something had already changed. Behind the curtain, Jungkook placed Jimin carefully onto a medical chair while staff gathered around them. Jimin insisted he could continue, but his voice was quieter than usual. "The fans came all this way," he murmured. Jungkook shook his head. "That's not the question right now." A medic began checking Jimin while another staff member contacted the concert director. Meanwhile, on stage, Suga continued performing with the others, but his attention kept drifting toward the side entrance. He knew the show was still moving forward. He knew thousands of people were watching. Yet one thought kept returning. Jimin had looked at him just before being carried away, and that look had not been one of fear. It had been something else, almost like a warning. Then, from backstage, a staff member quietly approached Suga during a transition and whispered a sentence that made him stop breathing for a moment. Jimin had asked for something to be brought to him before anyone called the hospital. And whatever that object was, Suga immediately knew why Jimin had asked for it. Backstage, the concert continued beneath a carefully controlled illusion. The audience could still hear music, the giant screens still displayed the performance, and the stage lights continued sweeping across the stadium as if nothing had interrupted the night. But behind the curtains, the atmosphere had completely changed. Jimin sat in a medical chair near the side corridor, one hand resting against his knee while a medic examined him. His breathing had steadied, but his face remained unusually pale. Jungkook stood beside him, refusing to move more than a few steps away. "Tell me where it hurts," the medic asked. Jimin hesitated. "It's not that bad." Jungkook immediately looked at him. That wasn't what he asked. Jimin lowered his eyes. For a moment, there was only the distant sound of thousands of fans singing along to the songs still being performed on stage. The medic gently checked his ankle and wrist, then asked him to move his fingers. Jimin did. Slowly. Nothing appeared seriously injured, but the fall had left him shaken, and the impact had caused enough pain to make standing difficult. "You need to stay seated for now," the medic said. Jimin nodded reluctantly. Then he looked toward the stage entrance. "Suga?" Jungkook followed his gaze. "He's still performing." Jimin's expression tightened. "I know." He said nothing else. A few meters away, a young backstage assistant named Minseo stood beside a production monitor, staring at the live feed. She had been working with the touring crew for only several months. Her job was simple on paper: help coordinate quick costume changes, deliver equipment, communicate timing cues, and make sure performers had what they needed between sections of the show. Tonight, however, she had made one mistake that she could not stop thinking about. Before the performance began, she had received a message from an unknown number. She had read it twice, deleted it, and told herself it had nothing to do with the concert. But now, after watching Jimin fall, the message felt different. Her hand slowly moved toward the pocket of her black production jacket. Inside was a small silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks. Nobody on the crew knew about it. Nobody knew why it mattered. And most importantly, nobody knew that Jimin had seen it earlier that evening. The memory came back to her with uncomfortable clarity. It had happened during rehearsal. Minseo had been rushing through a side corridor when the key slipped from her pocket and hit the floor. Jimin had been walking past with a bottle of water. He stopped, picked it up, and held it out to her. "You dropped this." She had taken it too quickly. "Thank you." Jimin had smiled, but his eyes had stayed on the key for a moment longer than expected. "It looks old." Minseo had laughed nervously. "It is." "Important?" Jimin asked. She had almost told him. Instead, she shook her head. "Just something from home." Then she walked away. She had thought the conversation was over. It wasn't. Now, while Jimin sat backstage after his fall, he suddenly asked, "Where is the blue ribbon?" Minseo froze. Jungkook looked at him. "What blue ribbon?" Jimin didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved toward the production monitor, then toward the corridor where staff were moving quickly between rooms. "The key," he said quietly. "I saw it earlier." Minseo heard him. Her face changed. She turned away before anyone could notice. But Jimin did. Even from across the room, he recognized the same nervous expression she had worn during rehearsal. He had seen people hide pain before. Sometimes they hid it behind smiles. Sometimes behind work. Sometimes behind the sentence, "I'm fine." He knew that expression too well to ignore it. "Minseo," he called. She stopped. "Can you come here?" She looked around as though hoping someone else would answer. Nobody did. She approached slowly. Yes? Jimin studied her face. Are you okay? The question was so ordinary that it nearly broke her composure. I'm fine. Jimin gave a faint, almost tired smile. That's what I said too. Jungkook looked between them. Minseo lowered her eyes. I really am okay. Then why are you shaking? Jimin asked. She immediately pulled her hands behind her back. She had not realized they were trembling. Before she could answer, a production coordinator called her name from the other side of the corridor. Minseo turned toward the voice. I have to go. Jimin didn't stop her. But as she walked away, he noticed something else. Her phone screen had lit up. One missed call. Then another. The caller name was simply saved as Mom. Minseo rejected the call. A few seconds later, another message appeared. She read it and immediately locked the screen. Jimin watched her disappear around the corner. Something's wrong, he said. Jungkook frowned. You just fell on stage and you're worried about someone else? Jimin looked at him. Maybe that's why I noticed. Meanwhile, the concert reached another major section. Suga stood beneath a narrow beam of light, microphone in hand, singing while his eyes occasionally moved toward the backstage entrance. His face remained composed for the audience, but his thoughts were somewhere else. During the next transition, RM moved closer. Any update? Suga shook his head. Not yet. RM watched him carefully. They said Jimin is being checked. I know. Suga's voice was flat. Then trust the staff. Suga looked at him. I trust them. He paused. I don't trust the way Jimin looked at me. RM didn't immediately understand. What do you mean? Suga turned toward the audience as the music began again. He looked like he wanted me to remember something. RM opened his mouth to ask another question, but the cue came and both returned to position. The show moved forward. Backstage, Minseo finally answered her mother's call. She walked into an empty storage room and closed the door. Mom? Her voice cracked immediately. A woman's exhausted voice came through the phone. You didn't answer. I'm working. I know. But the hospital called again. Minseo closed her eyes. What did they say? They need the deposit by tomorrow morning. Minseo leaned against a wall. I'll find it. You already said that. Silence. Minseo, you can't keep borrowing money. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. I know. Your brother asked if you were coming home. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Minseo looked down at the silver key in her hand. Tell him I'm trying. Trying isn't enough anymore. The call ended. Minseo remained alone in the storage room, staring at the key. The blue ribbon had once belonged to her younger brother. It was attached to the key to their old music practice room, a tiny rented room above a neighborhood shop where he had spent years learning piano before their family's financial problems forced him to stop. The room had eventually been abandoned. The landlord had given Minseo the key because she had promised to clear out the last belongings. She never did. Her brother's old notebook was still inside. So was the cheap keyboard he had once dreamed of using on stage. 3 weeks earlier, Minseo had discovered that the building was being sold. She had until the end of the month to retrieve everything. But the problem was no longer the room. Her brother had been hospitalized after an accident, and the medical bills had consumed everything they had. She had taken extra shifts. She had borrowed money. She had even considered quitting the tour. Then she received the anonymous message. It contained only 4 words, I know about the key. At first, she thought it was a cruel joke. Then another message arrived. Don't tell anyone. She had blocked the number. it came from another number the next day. That was when fear began replacing confusion. She had no idea who was sending the messages or why they wanted the key. She only knew one thing: the key opened a room containing documents that could expose a financial dispute involving the building's previous owner. The silver key stopped spinning beneath the production table, but nobody moved for several seconds. Jimin stared at it from the medical chair, his expression changing as he realized the key was no longer in Minseo's possession. Jungkook followed his gaze and immediately stepped between Jimin and the corridor. "Stay here," he said. Jimin tried to stand. Pain shot through his leg, forcing him back down. "Jungkook, wait." But Jungkook was already moving. He crouched beside the table and picked up the key without touching the ribbon. "This isn't yours, is it?" he asked. Minseo had gone completely pale. No, her voice was barely audible. "It is." She looked at the blue ribbon. "But I didn't drop it." That answer changed the atmosphere instantly. A staff member nearby looked toward security. The concert was still underway, and nobody wanted panic spreading through the backstage area. The production director had instructed everyone to keep the show moving unless there was a genuine medical emergency. Now there was a second problem, one that had nothing to do with choreography or Jimin's injury. Someone had entered a restricted backstage area, handled an object belonging to a crew member, and disappeared without being noticed. Jungkook handed the key to the security supervisor. "Find out who came through this corridor." The supervisor nodded and spoke quietly into his radio. Minseo looked toward Jimin. "Please don't get involved." Jimin frowned. "You think I'm going to sit here and pretend I didn't see that? You have a concert to finish." Jimin glanced toward the stage, where the muffled sound of the next song vibrated through the walls. "So do you." Minseo looked down. "That's different." Jimin waited. She finally admitted, "If the show stops because of me, everyone will know something happened." "Something already happened," Jimin replied. Before Minseo could respond, the security supervisor returned with a troubling update. The camera covering the corridor had not recorded anyone approaching the table. It had gone offline for approximately 90 seconds. Not the entire backstage system. Only one camera. Someone had either known exactly which camera to interfere with or had been extremely lucky. The supervisor immediately contacted the technical team. Jimin's expression became more serious. "How long was it offline?" "About a minute and a half." "And that's when the key disappeared?" Minseo nodded. Suga, who had returned from the stage during another transition, heard the last sentence. He walked over without speaking. His eyes went first to Jimin, then to Jungkook, then to the key inside the security supervisor's hand. "What happened?" Jungkook explained quickly. Suga listened without interrupting. When he finished, Suga looked at Jimin. "You need to leave the building." Jimin shook his head. "No, Jimin. The concert is still going." "That's not what I mean." Suga's voice lowered. "Someone has been inside the restricted area. You were injured. And now this." Jimin looked at him. "You think they're connected?" Suga didn't answer. His silence was enough. For a moment, the two looked at each other across the corridor. The tension between them was no longer about the fall. Jimin could see fear behind Suga's controlled expression, but he could also see something else: frustration. Suga had been trying to keep the night under control, and every new piece of information was taking that control away. "I'm not leaving," Jimin said. Suga's jaw tightened. "Why?" Jimin looked toward Minseo. "Because she looks more frightened than I do." Minseo immediately shook her head. "Please don't say that." But Jimin had already made his decision. He asked the medic if he could remain seated backstage while they continued evaluating his injury. The medic agreed, provided he did not attempt to return to the stage. That created another problem. The production director wanted the audience to believe Jimin was taking a brief break. The members would continue the concert without him. But if the show proceeded while security investigated an unknown person inside the building, every staff member would have to remain calm enough to prevent the audience from noticing anything unusual. Suga returned to the stage first. As he walked through the curtain, he stopped for 1 second and looked back at Jimin. "Don't move." Jimin gave him a faint smile. "You say that like I'm 5. Suga didn't smile back. "Tonight, just listen to me." Then he disappeared beneath the stage lights. The next performance began. On stage, Suga moved with precision, but his attention remained divided. Jungkook stayed backstage with Jimin while RM and the other members were informed through discreet communication. The audience saw nothing except a carefully adjusted formation. Yet backstage, security teams began checking doors, loading areas, staff entrances, and equipment corridors. Minseo stood near a wall, holding her phone in both hands. She had received another message. This time, it said, "You should have listened." She deleted it immediately. Jimin noticed. "Another message?" Minseo didn't answer. "Minseo." She looked at him. "I don't want you involved." "Too late." She swallowed. "If they find out they could use you to pressure me." Jungkook's expression hardened. "Who are they?" Minseo looked around before whispering, "I don't know." "Then what do they want?" "The key." "Why?" Minseo hesitated. "Because it opens something they don't want anyone to see." Jimin leaned forward. "What?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Documents." "What kind of documents?" "Financial records." Jungkook exchanged a glance with Jimin. The explanation sounded too complicated to belong inside a concert venue, but Minseo's fear was real. She explained that the old building where her brother had practiced music was being sold. While retrieving his belongings, she had found records suggesting that several tenants had been charged fees that were never properly documented. She had initially thought it was a minor dispute. Then she discovered that one of the names connected to the documents belonged to a company that had recently attempted to buy the building. The company had a representative who had approached her privately and offered money for the key. She refused. After that, the messages began. "Why didn't you report it?" Jungkook asked. Minseo looked ashamed. "Because I didn't know who to trust. And because my brother is sick." Jimin's expression softened. "What does that have to do with the money?" "Everything." Her voice cracked. "I thought if I gave them what they wanted, they'd pay me enough to cover his treatment. For one night, I almost did it." Silence settled over the room. Jimin didn't judge her. Instead, he asked, "But you changed your mind?" Minseo nodded. "Because I realized the documents weren't just about money. Other families were affected too." Suga returned from the stage during the next transition and heard the final sentence. He looked at Minseo. "So you were being pressured to choose between your brother and everyone else?" Minseo looked down. "Yes." Suga didn't respond immediately. His expression became distant, as though he understood the weight of a decision that had no clean answer. Then the production director entered. "We have another issue." Everyone turned toward him. "The hospital transport team has been delayed because the front entrance is crowded." Jimin looked confused. "Hospital transport?" The medic explained that although his injury did not appear immediately life-threatening, they wanted him examined properly because he was unable to bear weight. Jimin sighed. "I can go after the show." Suga immediately shook his head. No. Jimin looked at him. "The concert matters. And you matter." Jimin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't make this bigger than it is." Suga's voice became sharper. "I'm not the one making it bigger." You fell in front of 20,000 people. The argument stopped when Jimin noticed something unusual. Suga's anger wasn't really directed at him. It was directed at himself. Jimin lowered his voice. You're scared. Suga looked away. I'm busy. That's not an answer. Jimin took only 3 steps before the medic caught his arm. You can't walk like that. Jimin stopped, breathing through the pain, but his eyes remained fixed on the corridor leading toward the private dressing rooms. I don't need to walk far, he said. I just need to know who went in there. Suga moved beside him immediately. You're not going anywhere alone. Jungkook was already reaching for the radio. Security is checking the room. But Jimin shook his head. Wait. Something about the situation had finally connected in his mind, not because he had discovered a hidden camera or overheard a secret conversation, but because he remembered something almost everyone else had overlooked. Earlier that evening, before the concert began, he had noticed a handwritten label attached to one of the equipment cases near the dressing rooms. It had been marked with the same blue ink used on Minseo's key ribbon. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now it didn't. The person isn't looking for the documents, Jimin said. They're looking for something that tells them where the documents are. Suga stared at him. The key. Jimin nodded. But they already had it. Minseo's face tightened. Then why go into the dressing room? Jimin looked at her. Because they think someone else has the information. Jungkook suddenly understood. They think you gave it to one of us. Minseo nodded slowly. The idea sounded frighteningly plausible. She had been seen talking to Jimin. Jimin had noticed the key. Suga had questioned her. Anyone watching the backstage movements could have assumed the information had already changed hands. Suga's expression hardened. Then we stop guessing and find out exactly what they know. The security supervisor returned moments later. The dressing room is empty. Jimin frowned. Empty? Yes. Nothing disturbed except one drawer. He handed Suga a small plastic evidence bag containing a folded piece of paper. Suga opened it carefully. It was not a threatening note. It was a photocopy of an old photograph. In the picture, Minseo's younger brother stood beside a cheap keyboard in a tiny practice room. Written across the back were 3 words, "He remembers everything." Minseo covered her mouth. Jimin looked at her. Who took this? She shook her head. I don't know. Suga immediately understood that the situation had moved beyond financial pressure. Someone had been studying Minseo's family. They knew about her brother. They knew about the practice room. They knew she was working at the concert. And now they had deliberately placed the photograph where the group would find it. This isn't about the key anymore, Suga said quietly. It's about controlling her. Jimin looked toward Minseo. She was trembling. They want me to give them the documents, she whispered. And if I don't, she couldn't finish. Jimin didn't ask her to. Instead, he noticed something that everyone else had missed. The photograph had a crease down the middle. On the edge of the image, barely visible, was a handwritten number, 17. Jimin pointed at it. What's that? Minseo looked closer. Her expression changed immediately. Room 17. Where? Suga asked. The old building. Minseo swallowed. That's the number of my brother's practice room. Jungkook looked at the security supervisor. Can someone get there? The supervisor shook his head. We need to keep the venue secure first. Jimin looked at Suga. Neither needed to say what they were thinking. The person who had entered the dressing room might already know that the key was no longer in Minseo's hands. They might be heading to the old building next. But Jimin's injury meant he couldn't simply leave, and the concert was still in progress. Then RM entered the corridor. He had been informed about the situation and immediately understood the seriousness of it. "What's the plan?" Suga answered without hesitation. "We don't send anyone to the building alone." RM nodded. "I'll have management contact local authorities and verify the property records." J-Hope volunteered to stay with Minseo. Jean began coordinating with the staff to keep the remaining performers and crew separated from the restricted areas. V quietly checked whether Minseo had anyone she could call. Jungkook stayed beside Jimin. Each member contributed something different, not because anyone had a perfect solution, but because the situation had become too complicated for one person to carry. Jimin looked at the group and then back at Minseo. "Your brother," he said. "Where is he now?" "At the hospital." "Does he know about the documents?" Minseo shook her head. No. Jimin's expression softened. "Then don't tell him yet." Minseo looked confused. "Why?" "Because he already has enough to worry about." Suga glanced at Jimin. There was a subtle change in his expression. Earlier, he had been focused almost entirely on protecting Jimin. Now he understood why Jimin had refused to leave. Jimin wasn't ignoring his own injury. He had simply recognized that someone else was carrying a fear that nobody had noticed. The discovery became even more personal when Minseo revealed one more detail. The old practice room contained not only her brother's belongings, but a notebook in which he had written the names of everyone who had helped him during the years he struggled to continue playing music. "Why would someone care about a notebook?" Jungkook asked. Minseo looked at him. "Because one of the names belongs to the person who originally owned the building." Suga's eyes narrowed. "And that person is connected to the company trying to buy it?" "Yes." "So the notebook could prove they knew each other?" Minseo nodded. "But I don't know what else is inside." Jimin looked toward the corridor again. "Then that's what they want." Suga turned toward him. "You stay here." Jimin smiled faintly. "You really like giving orders tonight. And you really like ignoring them." For the first time since Jimin had fallen, there was a trace of warmth between them. But it lasted only seconds. The security radio crackled. "We found the jacket." Everyone turned. "Where?" the supervisor asked. "Loading dock. Abandoned behind a truck." Suga immediately walked toward the security team. "Was there anyone with it?" "No." "Then he changed clothes." "Possibly." Jimin's eyes narrowed. "Or he never wore it." The room went silent. "What do you mean?" Jungkook asked. Jimin pointed toward the jacket. "If someone wanted us to believe there was an intruder, leaving the jacket behind would be the easiest way to make us chase the wrong person." Suga looked at him. "You're saying the person could still be inside?" Jimin nodded. "And they wanted us to think they escaped." The security supervisor immediately ordered another sweep. Staff members began checking every restricted corridor. The concert was approaching its final song. The audience had no idea that the performers and crew were now operating under a completely different set of circumstances. Jimin looked at the stage monitor. The final performance would begin in less than 5 minutes. "If the person is still inside," he said, "they know we're running out of time." Suga stared at him. "Then we don't give them the time they want." He turned to the security supervisor. "Find the person." Quietly. Then he looked at Jimin. "And you stay here." Jimin opened his mouth to argue, but Suga continued. "Not because I think you're weak. Because I need one person in this building who isn't being watched." Jimin paused. That sentence made him reconsider. Suga was no longer trying to stop him from helping. He was giving him a role. Jimin nodded slowly. "Then I need the camera feeds." The technical director brought up the backstage monitors. Jimin studied them carefully. One by one, he watched the corridors, doors, staircases, and service entrances. He wasn't looking for a face. He was looking for behavior. Then he noticed something strange. A staff member had passed the same hallway 3 times in 10 minutes. The person was carrying an empty equipment case. On the 3rd pass, the case was gone. Jimin pointed at the screen. The noise of the concert faded behind the closed rehearsal room door, leaving only the low vibration of the stadium speakers passing through the walls. Jimin sat on a padded bench with his injured leg elevated, the small metal tag resting in his palm. Suga stood near the window, staring at the reflection of the empty corridor. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence between them was different from the silence backstage. There were no staff members asking questions, no radios crackling, no cameras watching. Just 2 people who had spent years learning how to recognize what the other one refused to say. "You should be angry with me," Jimin finally said. Suga turned. "Why?" "Because I knew something was wrong before the fall." Suga's expression tightened. "What did you know?" Jimin looked down at the tag. "Not about the person. About myself." He admitted that during rehearsals he had felt unusually tired and distracted, but he had decided not to mention it because the schedule was already complicated. He had believed he could push through one more performance. Suga listened quietly. Then he sat beside him. "So when you looked at me on stage," Jimin nodded. "I wanted you to know I wasn't ignoring you." Suga looked at him for a long moment. "I thought you were telling me not to interfere." Jimin gave a faint smile. "I was trying to tell you I was scared." That sentence changed Suga's expression. His eyes dropped to the floor. "I didn't understand." "You weren't supposed to." Jimin's voice was gentle. "Nobody was." Suga rubbed his hands together, struggling to find the right words. "When you fell, I couldn't think." Jimin glanced at him. "I saw. I hated that." "Why?" Suga took a breath. "Because I couldn't do anything. Jungkook got to you first. The staff knew what to do. Everyone had a job. I just stood there." Jimin shook his head. "You kept performing. That's not the same thing." "It was necessary." Suga looked at him. "You always say that when you don't want someone to worry." Jimin smiled slightly. "Maybe." Suga's gaze fell on the metal tag. "And this?" Jimin placed it on the bench. "I think someone wanted me to find room 17. "But why you?" "Maybe because they saw me talking to Minseo." Suga shook his head. "That's not enough." Jimin looked toward the door. "No. It's not." He paused. "There's something else." Suga waited. Jimin admitted that before the concert, Minseo had dropped the key. When he picked it up, he noticed a small engraving on the metal. It was not a room number. It was a symbol, a tiny crescent beside 2 letters. "I recognized the symbol," Jimin said. Suga looked surprised. "From where?" "From a notebook." "Whose?" "Minseo's brother's." Jimin explained that he had seen the same symbol in the practice room photograph Minseo had shown them earlier. He hadn't understood its meaning at the time. Now he believed it might connect the old building, the financial records, and the person following Minseo. Suga remained silent. Then he asked, "Why didn't you tell me before?" Jimin's expression softened. "Because I knew you'd stop me from performing." Suga gave a short, humorless laugh. "Correct." Jimin looked at him. "And because I didn't want tonight to become another night where everyone had to take care of me." Suga's face changed. "That's what you think?" Jimin shook his head. "No. That's what I was afraid of." The admission landed more heavily than any argument. Suga leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "You know what I misunderstood?" Jimin waited. I thought protecting someone meant keeping them away from danger. He looked at Jimin. Maybe sometimes it means trusting them enough to let them choose what they can handle. Jimin didn't respond immediately. His fingers moved toward the metal tag. Then trust me now. Suga frowned. To do what? To help Minseo. Suga shook his head. You are injured. I'm not asking to go anywhere. Jimin picked up the tag. I'm asking you to listen. Suga nodded. Jimin explained his theory. The person behind the messages wasn't simply trying to steal documents. They were trying to create enough confusion that Minseo would surrender the key willingly. The photograph of her brother, the jacket, the false security movements, even the tag placed in Jimin's pocket were designed to make everyone believe the threat was larger and closer than it really was. But one thing didn't make sense. If the person wanted the key, why leave evidence pointing toward room 17? Jimin believed the answer was psychological. They wanted Minseo to go there. Suga's eyes narrowed. A trap. Probably. Then why put the tag on you? Jimin looked at him. Because they knew you would follow me. Suga went completely still. The realization was painful. The person had been studying them, not just Minseo. They knew how Suga reacted to Jimin. They knew that if Jimin was threatened, Suga would move without waiting for permission. They had turned their relationship into part of the plan. Suga's voice dropped. I don't like that. Neither do I. Then we changed the plan. Jimin nodded. He reached for Suga's hand, but stopped halfway. Instead, he placed the metal tag between them. No one goes to room 17 alone. Suga looked at the tag. Agreed. Jimin added one more condition. And if they try to use me again, you don't react immediately. Suga looked at him. That's difficult. I know. Especially when it's you. Jimin smiled faintly. That's why I'm asking. Another silence followed. Outside, the crowd suddenly erupted into applause. The final song had begun. Jimin looked toward the sound. They're still singing. Suga nodded. They don't know what's happening. Maybe that's okay. Suga looked at him. Why? Because for once, we don't have to perform for them. The words settled quietly between them. Suga lowered his eyes. There was another reason I cried. Jimin looked at him. Suga hesitated before continuing. When I saw you fall, I remembered all the times you said you were fine when you weren't. I thought maybe I'd been accepting that answer because it was easier than asking again. Jimin's expression softened. You don't have to fix everything. I know. Suga looked toward the door. But I can listen. Jimin nodded. Then listen now. Suga waited. I'm scared, Jimin said. Not of the injury. Not even of whoever is doing this. He paused. I'm scared that one day we'll become so used to taking care of each other that we forget to ask whether we're actually okay. Suga didn't answer with a speech. He simply reached over and adjusted the blanket around Jimin's injured leg. Then he picked up the metal tag. We'll ask. Jimin smiled. Promise? Promise. A radio suddenly crackled outside the door. Suga, we need you. He looked toward the door but didn't move immediately. Jimin nodded. Go. Suga stood. Before leaving, he turned back. And you? Jimin looked at the tag. I'm staying here. Suga studied him for another second, then left. Jimin waited until the door closed. He looked at the metal tag one last time. The tiny crescent symbol caught the light. Then he noticed something engraved beneath it that he had not seen before, 2 letters and a date. His expression changed. It was the same date Minseo's brother had written on the first page of his old music notebook. Jimin finally understood why someone had been so determined to keep the notebook hidden. The documents were only part of the story. The real secret was connected to something that had happened years earlier, and someone had just used Jimin's fall to bring that secret back into the open. The final song reached its last chorus, but backstage, the night was moving toward a different ending. Jimin remained in the quiet room, staring at the date engraved beneath the crescent symbol. He remembered Minseo's brother's notebook, the photograph, the old practice room, and the strange message that had appeared on her phone. One date connected all of them. Before he could examine the tag again, the door opened. Minseo stood there, breathless. "They're looking for me." Jimin immediately straightened. "Who?" Security said someone tried to enter the medical area. Her eyes moved toward the corridor. "They asked where I was, and I realized they weren't really asking." Jimin's expression hardened. "Where's Suga?" On stage. The final notes of the concert echoed through the walls. Thousands of fans began chanting the members' names. Minseo looked at Jimin. "I think they know about the notebook." Jimin nodded slowly. "Then we don't go to room 17. "What?" "We make them think we are." Minseo stared at him. "That's dangerous." "So is letting them decide where we go." Jimin picked up his phone and called the security supervisor. "I need every exit watched, but nobody approaches room 17 yet." He explained the plan. The supervisor hesitated, then agreed. Jimin's hands were trembling slightly, but his voice remained calm. He knew they could not solve everything in one night. They could only stop someone from controlling the next move. Minutes later, the final music ended. The stadium erupted. On stage, Suga stood beneath the lights with the other members, smiling toward the audience, but his eyes immediately searched the side entrance. When he saw Jimin still seated safely backstage, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours. Then a staff member whispered something into his ear. Suga's expression changed. He looked toward the production monitor. A live feed showed Minseo walking toward the service corridor with an equipment bag. But Suga knew that wasn't Minseo. He had just received a message from Jimin telling him she was supposed to remain with security. "Stop the feed," Suga said. The image froze. "That's not her." The security team rushed toward the corridor. Suga followed. Jungkook intercepted him. "I'll go." Suga shook his head. "No. We go together." They reached the corridor just as the figure disappeared through a door. When security opened it, nobody was there. Only the equipment bag remained on the floor. Inside was the silver key. Minseo arrived seconds later with RM and the security supervisor. She stared at the bag. "That's not mine." Suga looked at the key. "Exactly." Someone wanted them to believe the key had been recovered. Jimin's theory was right. The real key was still inside the security evidence pouch. Whoever planted this one was creating a second false trail. Then Jimin appeared at the end of the corridor, supported by a staff member. Suga immediately moved toward him. "I told you to stay put." Jimin gave him a tired smile. "I did." Until they started using Minseo's face on the cameras. Suga looked confused. Jimin pointed toward the monitor. "The person isn't just wearing her jacket. They're using footage from earlier." The security supervisor understood. "A recorded feed." Jimin nodded. "They aren't moving through the building the way we think. They're manipulating what we see." The room went silent. The intruder had been creating false movements through selected cameras, making security chase shadows while the real person moved through blind spots. The supervisor immediately switched the surveillance system to manual monitoring. One by one, the false images disappeared. Then a live camera showed a person standing outside the private entrance to the medical area. The face was uncovered. Minseo gasped. That's him. Security moved. This time, there was nowhere for him to disappear. He was not a stranger to the crew. He was a former contractor who had worked on the tour months earlier and had been removed after a dispute over missing equipment. He had used old access information to enter the venue and had learned enough about Minseo's family situation to pressure her. But he had not acted alone. The investigation later would reveal that the financial dispute behind the old building was real, but the contractor had exaggerated his access to the documents in order to manipulate Minseo. He had never possessed the full records. He believed the notebook contained information that could be sold to the company involved in the property dispute. When security confronted him, he dropped his phone. The screen was still open to a message thread. Minseo stared at it. Her brother's name appeared in the conversation. She covered her mouth. How did he get his number? The contractor refused to answer. Jimin looked at Minseo, then at the phone. That's what we need to find out. The emotional weight of the night suddenly shifted. The threat was no longer an abstract figure moving through dark corridors. It had a face, a history, and consequences. Minseo began crying quietly, not because everything was solved, but because she finally knew she had not imagined the danger. Jimin remained beside her. Suga stood a few steps away, watching. He noticed Jimin's injured leg trembling from exhaustion. Without saying anything, he moved closer and offered his shoulder. Jimin leaned against him. The gesture was small, almost invisible amid the chaos, but it carried the weight of everything they had failed to say earlier. Then Minseo's phone rang. It was the hospital. She answered immediately. Her brother was awake. The doctor said his condition was stable, but he needed to remain under observation. Minseo closed her eyes and exhaled. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. But there was still one unfinished piece. The notebook. Jimin remembered the date engraved on the metal tag. He asked Minseo to call her brother and ask about it. She hesitated. What if he doesn't know? Then we find out together. She made the call. Her brother's weak voice came through the phone. When she asked about the date, there was a long silence. Then he said, I knew someone would eventually ask. Minseo's face changed. Who? Her brother answered, the person who owned the building before us. Suga listened carefully. What did he give you? Her brother hesitated. A recording. Everyone looked at Jimin. What recording? Minseo asked. Her brother explained that years earlier, the building owner had secretly recorded a meeting in which several tenants were pressured to leave after refusing an unfair rent increase. Her brother had accidentally discovered the recording while helping clean the practice room. He had copied the file into an old music player because he didn't know where else to store it. The notebook contained the password. The documents were only evidence of the financial dispute. The recording contained something more personal, a conversation proving that someone had deliberately targeted struggling families. Minseo began crying again. Why didn't you tell me? Her brother answered softly, because I didn't want you carrying my fear too. Jimin looked down. The words hit him harder than expected. He understood exactly what his brother meant. People often hid fear not because they wanted to deceive others, but because they believed silence was a form of protection. Suga looked at Jimin. Neither spoke. The meaning of the night had become clearer. Jimin had fallen because he had pushed himself beyond what his body could safely handle. Minseo had nearly surrendered the key because she was carrying more responsibility than anyone realized. Suga had nearly lost control because he had mistaken silence for safety. And Jungkook had carried Jimin because, in that moment, there was no time to debate who should help. The contractor was taken away for questioning, while management contacted the appropriate authorities regarding the property dispute and the unauthorized access. Nobody pretended the problem was solved immediately. There would be investigations, legal questions, medical concerns, and consequences. But the immediate danger had passed. The stadium outside was still alive with fans waiting for the members' final appearance. Suga looked toward the stage entrance. "We have to go back." Jimin looked at his injured leg. The stadium emptied slowly that night, but the building did not become quiet. Crew members dismantled equipment beneath work lights while security continued documenting every restricted area the intruder had entered. The excitement of the concert had disappeared, replaced by the practical exhaustion that follows a long night when something has gone wrong. Jimin was eventually taken for a proper medical examination. The injury was painful but not catastrophic, and the doctor advised rest and further observation rather than an immediate return to the stage. Jimin accepted the recommendation reluctantly. "So the doctor is officially more stubborn than me," he joked weakly. Jungkook, sitting nearby, gave him a look. "Finally, someone is." Jimin smiled, but his expression became serious when he noticed Suga standing outside the examination room. Suga had barely spoken since the concert ended. He looked exhausted, still wearing the same clothes from the performance. Jimin called him inside. "You're making the hallway nervous." Suga raised an eyebrow. "I'm standing." "Exactly." A small smile appeared between them, but neither pretended the night had been easy. Suga sat down. "How bad?" "Not as bad as it looked." Suga nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Jimin's injured hand. "You scared everyone." Jimin looked away. "I know. Me most of all." Jimin didn't answer. This time, he didn't need to. Meanwhile, Minseo spent the early hours of the morning speaking with investigators. The contractor's phone contained messages, photographs, and fragments of conversations that helped establish how he had gained access to the venue. But the investigation also revealed something more complicated. He had not invented the property dispute. The old building really had been involved in questionable financial practices, and several former tenants were prepared to provide testimony. The contractor had simply exploited the situation for his own benefit. That distinction mattered. It meant Minseo's fear had been justified, even though some of the information used against her had been manipulated. She had not imagined the pressure. She had simply been unable to see where the truth ended and the manipulation began. By sunrise, her brother's hospital room became the quiet center of the story. He was awake, exhausted, and embarrassed by the attention. When Minseo told him what had happened, he listened without interrupting. "Did you give them the notebook?" he asked. "No," he nodded. "Good." Minseo looked at him. "That's all you have to say?" Her brother smiled faintly. "You made the decision yourself. I didn't want you making it because of me." She sat beside his bed and held his hand. "I almost did." "I know." "How?" "Because you're my sister." That simple answer broke the tension between them. For months, they had spoken mostly about bills, appointments, schedules, and practical problems. Now, for the first time, they talked about the music room they had abandoned. He admitted that he had stopped playing not because he no longer loved music, but because he had become ashamed of needing help. Minseo confessed that she had secretly kept his old keyboard in storage. Neither had realized the other was carrying the same unfinished memory. Back at the hotel, the BTS members gathered for a short meeting with management. Nobody treated the incident like a dramatic story. There were safety procedures to review, security failures to examine, and decisions about whether the next performances needed additional precautions. RM focused on the practical issues. Jean made sure everyone had eaten. J-Hope checked on the crew members who had been frightened during the confusion. V quietly sent a message to Minseo asking whether her brother was stable. Jungkook remained mostly silent until the discussion turned toward Jimin's injury. "He shouldn't have performed after he first felt something was wrong," Jungkook said. Jimin looked at him. "I know. Jungkook nodded. I'm not blaming you. You sound like you're blaming me. I'm blaming the part of you that thinks everyone else's expectations matter more than your body. The room became quiet. Suga looked at Jimin but didn't interrupt. Jimin accepted the criticism because it was not delivered with anger. It came from concern. Later, when everyone had left, Suga found Jimin alone near the hotel window. The city lights reflected against the glass. You should be sleeping, Suga said. So should you. I don't have an injured leg. Jimin smiled. Fair point. Suga handed him a cup of water. I talked to the manager. Jimin waited. They want you to rest for the next schedule. For how long? Long enough. Jimin sighed. I hate that answer. I know. Suga leaned against the window. But this time, you don't get to negotiate. Jimin looked at him. You're enjoying this? A little. They laughed quietly. It was the first ordinary moment they had shared since the fall. Yet beneath it was a new understanding. Suga was no longer trying to control Jimin's decisions. He was making it clear that concern could coexist with respect. Jimin was no longer hiding discomfort simply to keep the schedule moving. Neither change was dramatic. That was precisely why it mattered. A few days later, the concert footage began circulating among fans. Short clips showed the moment Jimin fell and Jungkook rushed toward him. Other clips captured Suga's expression during the performance. Speculation spread quickly. Some fans worried. Others tried to determine whether the fall had been part of the choreography. The members did not feed the rumors. Instead, a brief official statement confirmed that Jimin had sustained a minor injury and was receiving appropriate care. The statement did not mention Minseo, the security incident, or the investigation. Those details belonged to the people directly involved. Among fans, however, one moment became especially meaningful. During the final goodbye, Suga had told the audience that Jimin was listening. Many fans interpreted the sentence simply as reassurance. For Suga, it meant something more personal. He knew Jimin had been behind the curtain, listening to thousands of people call his name. He knew that sometimes a person didn't need to be physically visible to feel supported. Meanwhile, Minseo returned to the old practice room with 2 investigators and her brother's permission. The room smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint metallic scent of a keyboard that had not been played in years. She found the notebook beneath a stack of sheet music. On the first page was a handwritten sentence from her brother: "If I stop playing, remind me why I started." Minseo sat on the floor for several minutes. She realized she had spent months trying to protect him from disappointment while he had been trying to protect her from guilt. Neither had needed protection from each other. They had needed honesty. The notebook and recording were eventually handed over to the authorities handling the property dispute. The process would take time. Some tenants would need legal assistance. Some claims might never be fully resolved. But the evidence gave them something they had not had before: a chance to be heard. Minseo's brother began rehabilitation slowly. He could not return immediately to the life he had imagined, but he started playing the keyboard again for 10 minutes a day. Then 15. His sister sat nearby, doing paperwork while listening. One evening, he stopped and said, "It's strange." "What?" "I thought the hardest part would be starting again." Minseo smiled. "What's the hardest part?" He looked at the keyboard. "Believing I'm allowed to." Across the city, Jimin heard about the practice room through a message from Minseo. He read it twice. Then he showed it to Suga. Suga nodded. "Good." Jimin smiled. "That's all? What do you want me to say?" "Something profound." Suga shrugged. He played again. Jimin laughed. "You're impossible." Suga looked at him. "Maybe that's the point. Not everything needs a big speech." Jimin became quiet. He looked down at his healing leg. The fall had forced him to slow down, but it had also exposed something he had been avoiding. He had become accustomed to measuring his worth by how much he could endure. Now he was learning that stopping did not mean failing. Resting did not mean disappointing people. And asking for help did not mean. 6 months passed before anyone from that night returned to room 17. By then, the building looked different. Several tenants had moved out, the disputed sale had been placed under review, and the narrow staircase leading to the practice rooms had been repainted. The changes were modest, but to Minseo they felt enormous. Her brother, Miho, had returned to playing regularly. He still had difficult days, and the financial problems had not disappeared, but music had slowly become part of his routine again rather than a reminder of everything he had lost. The blue ribbon remained tied to the keyboard stand. The silver key sat inside a small wooden box on the desk. It no longer represented fear. It represented a choice Minseo had made when she could have taken the easier path. She had refused to sell information that belonged to other struggling families, even when she desperately needed money for her brother's treatment. Later, with assistance from people who had learned about the dispute, she found legitimate financial support for his care. It was not a miracle. There were applications, delays, paperwork, and nights when she still worried about bills. But she no longer carried the burden alone. The contractor's case continued through the legal system, while the larger property dispute moved separately. Some families reached settlements. Others chose to continue fighting. The old recording became evidence rather than a secret, and Miho eventually agreed to provide his testimony. He was nervous the first time he spoke about what he had witnessed years earlier. Minseo sat beside him. This time, neither of them tried to protect the other by staying silent. Meanwhile, Jimin's recovery had changed the way he approached rehearsals. He no longer treated every ache as something that had to be hidden until after the performance. He listened when his body told him to slow down. He accepted adjustments without seeing them as weaknesses. The members noticed the change, but they didn't make a big announcement about it. Jungkook simply became more persistent about asking whether Jimin needed anything before rehearsals. Jin began leaving food nearby whenever schedules became long. J-Hope checked whether Jimin was overworking himself. RM occasionally reminded everyone that taking care of the person next to you was part of taking care of the team. And Suga changed in a quieter way. He stopped asking Jimin, "Are you okay?" as though the question itself was enough. Instead, he started asking more specific questions. Did you sleep? Does it hurt when you move? Do you actually want to do this, or do you feel like you have to? Jimin noticed. One evening, he finally laughed. You've become very annoying. Suga looked up from his phone. Good. You ask too many questions. Better than asking too few. Jimin smiled. Their relationship had not suddenly become perfect. They still disagreed. Suga could still become overly protective. Jimin could still become stubborn. But now, when one of them noticed the other withdrawing, they were more willing to say something before silence became a wall. The concert where Jimin had fallen was rarely discussed publicly between them. They didn't need to revisit every detail. What remained with them was a small object and one unfinished promise. The metal tag with the number 17 had been returned to Miho. Jimin had originally intended to keep it as a reminder, but Miho refused. It belongs here, he said. It was part of the reason we started again. So Jimin gave it back. The tag was placed beside the keyboard, next to the blue ribbon. Months later, Miho played a small community performance in the same neighborhood where the old practice room stood. It wasn't a glamorous stage. There were no giant screens, no moving lights, and no thousands of fans. There were folding chairs, a borrowed sound system, and a small audience made up mostly of neighbors, friends, and families who had heard about his return to music. Minseo stood near the side of the room, holding her phone. She had been nervous all afternoon. Her brother walked onto the small stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked toward the empty chair where he had asked Jimin and Suga to sit if they were able to come. He knew they had complicated schedules. He wasn't expecting them. Then the back door opened. Minseo turned. Jimin entered quietly, wearing a simple cap and jacket, with Suga beside him. No cameras followed them. No announcement was made. Minseo stared for a second before laughing in disbelief. "You came." Jimin smiled. "You invited us." Suga looked at the tiny stage. "We weren't going to miss this." Miho saw them and froze. For a moment, he forgot the next chord. The audience looked toward the back. Jimin raised one finger to his lips, asking everyone not to make a scene. Miho smiled and began playing. The music was imperfect. His hands trembled during the first few notes, and one transition came slightly late. But nobody stopped him. Jimin watched carefully. Suga sat beside him with his arms folded, quietly listening. When the song ended, the room applauded. Miho looked toward them. Jimin simply nodded. It was enough. Afterward, they gathered in room 17. The old keyboard had been repaired. The walls still carried faint marks from years of use. On one shelf sat Miho's notebook, now filled with new pages. Jimin opened it and saw a sentence written beneath the old one: "If I stop playing, remind me why I started. If I am afraid to start again, remind me that stopping is not the same as losing." Jimin read it twice. Suga stood beside him. "That's better than anything we could have written." Miho smiled. "I learned it the hard way." They talked for nearly an hour. There was no dramatic confession, no perfect ending. Miho told them about the first day he had returned to the keyboard and how difficult it had felt. Jimin spoke about his own recovery without turning it into a lesson. Suga mostly listened. At one point, Miho asked him, "Why did you cry that night?" Suga looked toward Jimin. Jimin immediately laughed. "Good question." Suga sighed. "I don't know if I have a good answer." Miho waited. "I thought I had to keep everyone safe," Suga finally said. "And when I couldn't, I realized I had confused control with care." The room became quiet. Miho nodded. "I think a lot of people do that." Jimin looked at Suga. "Especially us." They smiled. Later that evening, Jimin and Suga walked down the same narrow staircase they had climbed months earlier during the chaos of the investigation. The building was quiet. Rain tapped against the windows. Suga stopped near the entrance. "Do you remember what you asked me that night?" Jimin looked at him. "Which part?" "You asked me to trust you." Jimin nodded. "And you did." "Eventually." Jimin laughed. "Very generous." Suga smiled. "I learned something else." "What?" "Trust isn't deciding that nothing bad will happen." He paused. "It's knowing what you'll do if something does." Jimin looked back toward the upper floor. "And what do we do now?" Suga thought about it. "We don't wait until someone falls." Jimin smiled. "That's actually profound." "Don't tell anyone." They walked outside together. The rain had stopped. Months later, the story of Room 17 became something Minseo and Miho rarely discussed outside their family and closest friends. They didn't want their lives defined by the night someone tried to manipulate them. Instead, Minseo began volunteering with a local support program that helped young musicians facing financial hardship. She understood how quickly a struggling artist could become vulnerable when money, family responsibility, and fear collided. Her brother began helping with the music side of the program. He taught beginners who reminded him of himself before everything became complicated. He kept the old blue ribbon on his keyboard, not because he feared losing it anymore, but because it reminded him of the person he had been before he stopped believing he could continue. And Jimin kept one small habit from that night. Before important performances, he would sometimes look toward the people around him and ask a different question. Not, is everything ready? Not, are we on time? But simply, is everyone okay enough to do this? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it wasn't. When it wasn't, the schedule changed. There are moments that look small from the outside but become impossible to forget for the people who lived through them. A missed step. A trembling hand. A door closing in a quiet hallway. A question asked 1 second too late. The night Jimin fell was never really about the fall. It was about everything that became visible because someone finally stopped moving long enough to notice it. Jimin learned that strength could include admitting when he needed help. Suga learned that caring for someone did not mean controlling every outcome. Mincio learned that asking for help was not a betrayal of the people she loved. Miho learned that losing time did not mean losing the right to begin again. And the people around them learned something less dramatic but perhaps more difficult. Sometimes compassion begins before you understand the entire story. You notice the person who keeps saying they're fine. You notice the silence after a phone call. You notice the hand that trembles when nobody is looking. You notice when someone who is usually moving suddenly stops. None of those things guarantees that you can fix what is wrong. Sometimes you cannot. Sometimes all you can do is remain present long enough for another person to decide they no longer have to hide. Months after that concert, the lights in another stadium would rise, another crowd would begin singing, and another performance would eventually come to an end. The world would keep moving exactly as it always does. But somewhere, in a small room above an ordinary street, a blue ribbon would still hang from a keyboard. A notebook would remain open to a page filled with new music. And a silver tag marked with the number 17 would sit quietly nearby, not as a symbol of fear, but as a reminder that one difficult night had revealed something worth carrying forward. Jimin and Suga never needed to turn that night into a legend. They simply remembered what it taught them. When someone you love says they are fine, sometimes the kindest response is not to argue, and not to walk away. Sometimes it is to stay long enough to ask one more question, and to be ready for whatever answer comes next. So if you were standing backstage that night, watching someone you cared about fall while the entire world continued cheering, would you have tried to protect them from the truth? Or would you have stayed beside them and asked the question they might have been too afraid to ask themselves?